Lawmakers from BRICS countries have called for the abolition of visa requirements related to trade. Now, the MPs gathered in Johannesburg this week for a parliamentary forum. Delegates also discussed issues around climate change and African partnership. Let's get more on the recommendations coming out of the commissions with Xolile George, who's the Secretary of the South African Parliament. A very good afternoon to you. Welcome. Thank you for joining us here on Newzroom Afrika. Perhaps maybe let's start off with an understanding of role, some clarity on what the BRICS PF Parliamentary Forum seeks to achieve.
Well, good afternoon, Paul, and good afternoon to all the Newzroom Afrika viewers. The BRICS Parliamentary Forum is a forum of parliaments of the 5 original founding members of BRICS. Mm-hmm. And essentially, it is a structure of parliaments of the countries who have come together for almost 15 years now to establish areas that look at developing approaches around global discourse issues around mutual interest for economic development, mm-hmm. issues around sustainable development, but areas largely around collaboration to reinforce the values and ideals of multilateralism. So parliaments then came together under the auspices of BRICS to make sure that those focus areas that shape global discourse, there is an expression around areas of South cooperation, which BRICS is essentially a structure around that. So the session that we have had in Johannesburg was a 9th BRICS forum. Yeah. And it comes immediately after we had recently in July the BRICS forum of the executive, where the various heads of states, as you will recall, Mpo, mm-hmm. have gathered in Johannesburg on what has been hailed globally as a very successful engagement where South Africa's chairing of BRICS heralded a new era around many commitments that were shared across all the board. So when we meet in Johannesburg over the last 3 days, which was also a very successful gathering under the theme of enhancing multilateralism as well as deepening parliamentary diplomacy, to look at areas around deepening Africa and BRICS relations. Mm. As you will recall, in Africa, we have areas around developing common approaches to building our economies through the Africa Free Trade Agreements and partnerships. So the primary focus on that was to renew the focus of BRICS Parliament, but at the same time, welcome the new members, the 6 members that have been recently accredited in July in South Africa. And we're quite pleased as the Parliament of the Republic of South Africa that out of those 6 members, 5 of them were in attendance. Many African parliaments were also in attendance. And to us, it heralded a new era altogether, where BRICS before used to meet on the sidelines of what is called in parliaments, an association of parliaments is called Interparliamentary Union. So yeah. It will be a sideshow. But for the first time, the focus of BRICS Parliament from meeting on its own, it became a seminal moment for us in that it was not just a gathering. It also cemented relations between the founding members, but also embracing the new members through a memorandum of agreement.
Yeah, I want us to get yes. talking a little bit about that a little bit yeah. later, but the conversation around the African Continental Free Trade Agreement and its potential impact on BRICS nations. I mean, that conversation is perhaps ongoing from July. What about the discussions around creating new avenues for trade and opening up the possibilities for expanded investments? That in itself is quite imperative. How far and how intricate did those discussions go?
Over the last 2 days, Paul, there were very fruitful deliberations in our commissions around those areas. Remember, what brings BRICS family together is areas around shared prosperity, yearning for global peace, but also approaching development from an equitable and just outcomes that not only ensure the balance, but also provides for sustainable growth of our own countries, so that even if there's trade between member countries within BRICS family, there's common approaches to areas of development, there's common approaches to global discourse issues like climate change, but all of those are shared around the common approaches that the United Nations Development Framework on SDGs outlined for each of the countries. So we're quite pleased that in such areas under the Africa Free Trade Agreements were quite deliberated, and also common approaches in the model of agreement begins to outline under peace and stability what are the areas that we must look at that are of mutual interest and benefit. Secondly, economic development. And thirdly, areas around human rights were discussed in such a way that as a BRICS family, with the expanded focus, we must develop areas of common interest so that when there's global discourse on this, the family of BRICS within the South-South cooperation begins to develop common positions on these matters.
Is that how far that Parliament's role can become in maximizing these benefits, especially looking at the African Continent Free Trade Agreement?
Well, as you know, Africa itself gathers under the auspices of the African Union. African Union has recently been added as a member of the G20. Now, in that regard, when you look at that kind of partnership within Africa, areas of economic development are now a major focus under the Africa Free Trade Agreement. You now have areas of energy, which within BRICS is a major topical issue. So even the additional members that we have in the Middle East, in Ethiopia, in Egypt, and Iran, and the UAE, and Argentina, bringing together that combined strength helps parliaments to begin to understand commitments made by heads of state, and thereby, consistent with the role of parliament, to develop laws, to look at regulations, to look at international agreements that must underpin those state commitments led by heads of states. Parliament become the catalyst to support those commitments that at a member state level are central to driving and fostering economic coherence of BRICS countries, but also create a bloc that is very central to driving the ideals that the future belongs to multilateralism. No longer the question of unipolar world, the multipolar world, the center around shifting towards multipolar approaches to global issues begins to bring together coherence on the approach to global discourse issues.
What about some of the recommendations that came out of these commissions? I mean, surely those may have been expanded on, especially looking perhaps at where the continent is standing as you and I speak, still recovering from the impact of COVID-19, and discussions that you had in order to perhaps help strengthen economic ties with the continent and stimulate its economic transformation. What does that look like so far as the recommendations that were put out by the commissions?
We're quite excited that a number of commissions that were established around peace and security, around climate change, around economic development, and look at trading as a focus area in the commission is very central to Africa. As you know, we are grappling from a disadvantaged background as Africa, still tackling many areas of underdevelopment, tackling questions of underdevelopment, poverty, and inequality, especially around examining the just order, the just and humane order that Africa is aspiring to. So that when it approaches, it's not approaching the world conversation from a backing point of view. Africa has resources. All we need is Africa being supported to have a focused development agenda to allow intra-Africa trade first. And then when it trades with its huge resources that it has, it is receiving a just appreciation to make sure that its development challenges, it is able to unlock economic opportunities, but respond to its major structural constraints that, as a South, it has always been a major feature of characterizing the underdevelopment that is running through the rest of Africa.
Speaking during his keynote address, Deputy President Paul Mashatile said the BRICS PF has the potential to effect change on a global and unprecedented scale, but he did warn that it shouldn't come as a surprise when the success factor then attracts negative responses from some actors in the world, despite the fact that BRICS is not opposed to any state parties or groups. Is that a genuine concern that needs to be monitored?
No, it is. Definitely, as the Deputy President has outlined, it's important that within Africa itself, working under the auspices of the African Union and as parliaments working under the umbrella of the Pan-African Parliament, we begin to examine tools that will first foster greater levels of economic participation within Africa, greater levels of enhancing intra-Africa trade itself, so that it doesn't continue to stay less than 18%. And yet, the other countries that trade with us, we need to unlock those so that issues around peace and security, mobility of people within Africa, human capital development, the visa migration requirement, relaxation of those rules in such a way that we foster internal collaboration first. It makes it easier then when Africa unlocks the opportunities. It may, of course, attract negative concerns elsewhere. But what the prospects of BRICS brings on the table is that fostering mutual cooperation by countries that are hitherto disadvantaged augurs well for those countries, so that when they approach global discourse on such issues of inequality, issues of just energy transition, issues of human rights, atrocities that are prevalent in many countries, you know that within the family that is now cohering around these common values of shared prosperity, shared peace, but also sustainable development that is more balanced and equitable, you are able to approach these matters within the umbrella of UN from a stronger position as the global south.
Yeah.
And that's the most strategic shift that brings so at the center and locus around multilateralism becomes the championing cause for the world order.
I mean, what about the critics who may say that the BRICS nations have failed to rebuild the global financial order? I mean, as you speak about these robust discussions that we're engaged in and some of the recommendations that have been put on the table, one might ask, how does it all now begin to impact, how do we begin to measure the impact of these discussions for the ordinary man on the street?
Understandable, Mpo. There would always be impatience around what this actually means.
Yeah.
Because if you look at the theme of our parliamentary forum, hosted by South Africa as a chairpersonship, it began to signal a fundamental shift. South Africa brought a theme that brings together fostering of relations within Africa. And what brings us together as Africa is the Africa Free Trade Agreement. And it has got a number of focus areas around looking at how best, as I said earlier on, promote intra-trade.
Yeah.
What are the regulatory enablers on that? What are the state commitments around fostering this? So at the level of the executive, those issues are articulated and there's leadership given around that. Our role as Parliament is to make sure that each of the member states are supported with tools that are of common approaches around those matters. So we're quite pleased that when you look at additional members, they also bring opportunities for greater levels of coherence. The major mobilizing issue is energy, and for us in particular in South Africa. So quite across Africa, the issues around just energy were very central in the debates, so that even if there's infrastructure financing options, we begin to develop common approaches so that the BRICS banks, when there's regional issues, our parliaments are ahead of ensuring that adaptation within each country's realities takes into account that countries can now foster bilaterals within the trade arrangements, but also approach these discourses from a collective strength.
Very well. Thank you so much for your time. Thanks for joining us in studio there. Xolile George, Secretary of the South African Parliament.